Thank you for coming and joining us for the Ministry of Managing Money webinars designed to help equip congregational treasurers and people who are involved in financial management in their congregation. Just a reminder of who the presenters are, or introduction to some of the presenters today. I'm Karen Plater. I'm the Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Planned Giving at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and I think most of you will be familiar with me. I'm delighted to be joined by Maurice Mawhinney. He's a Presbytery of West Toronto treasurer, and he's a member of the PCC Finance Committee, and he's just a volunteer extraordinaire. He's got a very in-depth knowledge of the ins and outs of finances. So he's been instrumental in helping us put this together, as well as to compile the Treasurer's Handbook. Jim McDonald is my colleague in the Stewardship and Planned Giving department. He's the development manager. We have Oliver Neng, who is the CFO of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. We are joined as well by Larry Eastwood. He's a congregational treasurer for a number of congregations, joining us from British Columbia, and Bill Patterson, a congregational treasurer from Alberta. Some of you may recognize those names if you participated previously, because they were pretty active in the chat, answering questions. So I recruited them to help present this webinar. Just to say that if you ask or provide answers in the chat, you might get recruited as well. I need to introduce Heather Chappell. She's the education coordinator, and I missed her on the list, and she is monitoring the chat and helping to ask the questions. Next slide. Just a reminder, most of the information you can find that we're talking about is available in the Treasurer's Handbook, which you can download for free from the PCC website. I've also used a number of principles that come and best practices that come from church finances, from missional leaders, best practices for faithful stewardship by Bonnie Ives Marden. And I have been chatting with her. I may have her lead some webinars in the future, really looking at the ins and outs of the theological issues around treasurers and recording church finances. So let's begin our webinar. How can we tell our story using the financial statements and budgets that we've been working on developing? Well, the first thing to remember, if we went back to session 1, is that one of the jobs of the treasurer is to produce reports so that people can follow and understand the money issues of the congregation. Now, when you're producing reports, it's good to keep in mind the different audiences that you are producing for. So, for example, we have the session, the congregation, donors, and we have presbytery, your synod, and the national office, and we get most of our information from the statistical report, as well as the Canada Revenue Agency, which is the CRA and issues the charitable registration status that allows you to issue receipts, as well as banks, insurance, foundation, and grant makers. Now we're going to look at the top 5 categories, because the banks, insurance, foundations, and grant makers are often very specific about what they want in their reports. And the information, if you're doing the first 5 all correctly, is going to be available to you. But we just wanted to say that this is another audience you may have to do reports for. So this is also a repeat from session 1, but the things that you want in your report characteristics are the same things you want in your financial statements and your budgets. They need to be understandable, relevant, reliable, consistent, and comparable. They should also be very accurate and should be reconciled to your bank accounts. This will all help making your reports easier. Next slide. All right, so you're going to do your reports for your session. For the session, they're for sure going to want to know the details for your operating budget and your special funds. They're going to want to dig in and out, because as we learned in session 1, the session is the one responsible for all financial aspects of the congregation. So you want to be sure that their reports are providing them enough details so that they know, but then also help them to see the big picture. You're probably going to provide monthly updates, at least for your session. Then you've got your congregation. Most of the congregation just really needs to know more of the big picture. They don't need to know all of the ins and outs of that the session needs to know. But they need to know enough so that they know that you're being transparent and accountable. They'll be presented usually at the annual general meeting is where they'll get their update. And you can present the operating budget and special funds. You may also have periodic updates on very specific things such as budget income. Donors. Now this donors, they may be your members and adherents from the congregation and the session, but they may also be from your community, from a foundation, from outside the congregation, somebody who's been touched by one of the programs of the church. They mostly want to hear the impact of donations and the stories of lives changed. And I can guarantee that the session, the congregation, are also interested in those stories. So, what do we include and how do we do periodic updates? Well, the first thing is, and I know that all of you probably who've gone to church for a long time, it's not unusual for you to think for the treasurer to stand up in front of the congregation or to include in a bulletin, the annual bulletin for the Sunday service, a line which says, this is how much the church has received and this is how much we need, or we needed. But I'm going to talk to you and give you a few ideas of how you're doing those updates and how you could just change it a little, but can completely change the tone of the update that you give. It's important to know first that people give in the way that they receive. And I'm going to give credit to Dr. Callahan for this slide. He presented it at Stewards by Design and gave permission for all participants to share it around. So this is used with permission. So first of all, we have people who are in the agriculture. So we know people who are in agriculture, their income comes in when the harvest comes in. That may just be in Canada once a year. So you might have a once a year income or primarily that way. So for most people who are salaried, they may get paid on a weekly basis, a bi-weekly basis, or a monthly basis. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then we have people who are self-employed or working in seasonal industries. They may just get paid seasonally. So maybe there'll be times when the income is quite high, other times when it's lower, depending on how things are going with their business. So keep that in mind. Because the thing is that often when we look at the giving patterns in a budget, the budget has often assumed that the giving is going to be the same from January to February to March, April. And maybe in an era that it was all the same. But I suspect that even in years and years and years ago, there was different giving patterns. So let's look at what today's giving pattern might be. And I hope that most of you can relate to this. So January, for example, might be a low month as people are trying to catch up and pay their credit card bills after Christmas. May slightly increase for February and March and April. We're getting around Easter where you've got a big participation in the congregation, so you might have a large amount. Then it might drop off a little bit more towards May and June. And suddenly we have July and August and we see a drastic drop off. And that's because people were away and they're not thinking about giving to the congregation, unless you have people who are on par. Even then, you'll probably see that big drop, but it could be mitigated by the people who are on par. So then after, August, September, it starts to climb up again. You might get a real bump around Thanksgiving in October, then it might drop a little bit more, and then it might increase more in November, and then really shoot up in December as people are thinking, oh, what have I given this year? And have I given as much as I wanted to give? And I've got my taxes coming up and I need to file that. And I know with COVID, who knows? I bet a lot of congregations saw big jump us up in COVID, especially if their congregation members were like me, and on December 31st, we're saying to the treasurer, oh, what's the e-transfer email address I can use again to send you what I would intended to send this year for the offering? Okay, next. So how else can you present your budget? Well, you can look at the 3-year average of each of your months. So let's say January, you got 6% of your budget in, and in January 2019 and 2020 was 5%, and then 2021 was 7%. So you've got a 3-year average of 6%. And your 2022 budget is $100,000. So you're like, okay, you're budgeting at the 8.33% if you're assuming that giving is going to be consistent and the same all year round. Well, then you might include in your bulletin or standing in front of the congregation, well, we needed $8,330, but we only received $6,110. So we were short $2,223. It's not really an encouraging message for the congregation, and not one that I think is going to encourage or set up giving for the rest of the year. For a few people, they'll be like, oh, we're behind and we need to catch up. But others are going to go, what? Why is the budget so unrealistic? I was giving what I always give, or I was giving what I expected. So let's look at a different way to present it. Let's say we've got a very similar giving pattern from the past 3 years. We've got the same budget, but we've said, okay, our goal is 6%. In January, we say our goal was $6,000. What was given is $6,100. Now I want you to see there was also another subtle difference in these two slides. One was that what was received. So what did the church receive? That looks at the church. Whereas this one is what was given. So what did people give? So 6,100. Wow, that's great. Let's say thank you. Now let's suppose a different year. We'll go to the next slide. That same circumstances. The 3-year average 6%. January, we say $6,000 was given, but our goal was $6,000, but only $5,500 was given. What do we say then? Do we say, oh no, we're short, we're behind? No, we say the same. Thank you very much. We're going to keep going. People can see that they're down a little bit. You don't have to point that out to them. It's presented. You've said this is what's given and thank you. And then we're going to go on to the next month and see how it goes. Now let's say another scenario, that same circumstances, but people have given this time $8,000. So they're way over what you expected. Thank you. We're very excited. We're going to do more. You might even have a dream budget and you can say, oh, this is going to allow us to do, we're ahead of where we expected. This is going to allow us to do some of these new things. What you don't want to say is that, oh, wow, we're ahead. You don't need to give more, or give the impression that they don't need to give more next year. Everything that's been given has been given to do God's mission. And I'm sure as a congregation, I don't have to tell you that you've got dreams and that you can use those gifts to do God's work. All right, so that's our little Kevin Callahan flashback. Does anybody have any questions on that subject? Okay, I'm going to keep going. All right, so now we're going to move to the annual general meeting. So let's remember what our annual general meeting is for. It is primarily to report and to celebrate the accomplishments of the church. It's to cast vision for the future. And in part, it's to receive the financial statement, including the audit or financial review, and approve a budget for the coming year. So we're going to look at and talk about how doing number 3 can both participate in number 1, reporting and casting a vision. Next. But I'm going to turn it over to Larry Eastwood to take it from here.
Thank you. In session 1, we talked about audits, but just to recall that an audit is that the books are examined by someone other than the treasurer and someone who is at arm's length from the session. The CRA does not require most congregations because we fall below a threshold for audits. However, it's certainly the best practice. We want to do it. And that can be a professional audit. KPMG comes to mind. It could just be a local CPA who does an audit, or for most of us, it is someone who is just somewhat independent from the rest of the financial process within the congregation, and they go through the handbook for treasurers and go through all of the steps that are there and check them off and then do a report to session.
This is a quick question, Larry, so I'll ask it now. In your experience, should the auditor be compensated? And if so, how much?
Usually, if it's just someone within the congregation who's volunteering, certainly a small honorarium. I've given $300. But if they really say they don't want money, then give them either some flowers or a little gift card to a local restaurant, just to say thank you for the 6, 7, 8 hours they may have poured over the books. Prepping for the AGM, it's good to know your people and to anticipate what sort of questions may be coming up, and then just put them right into your presentation, whether that's slides or verbal. Typically, one shows 2 or even 3 years of budget, and then the actuals, budget, actual, and then you look, that provides the basis for justifying this year's proposed budget. And it gives enough information to people to make a decision and see whether your numbers are reasonable, or to point out where the radical changes are and to ask why. Next slide. Congregations it's mandated that they have it in their hands 2 weeks before the meeting. Unfortunately, if you're invested in the consolidated portfolio or with many banks, particularly in stocks and bonds, you won't get the information for at least until the end of February, which means that your annual meeting needs to be pushed off to March. You also need to leave some time for the local auditor to complete their audit, as well as for the secretary, who will take a week to compile everything and then do the layout and do the actual physical printing or get it off to the printer. Next. So Karen?
Sorry, any questions about this right now? Let me just look. Just a comment, Phyllis is sharing that I look after a 3-point charge for shared ministry. I do up a statement each month and balance out by giving one church a less amount and the next month, the next church, and so on. At year end, this usually works out, but for 2021, one charge paid 1 cent more. I will then start with 2 other charges in 2022. Wow, that's an interesting way to share it around, Phyllis. I don't have any there was another comment that the Central Presbyterian Church in Cambridge uses a 3-year historical analysis to determine the revenue profile throughout the year. So I guess that was a comment on my revenue profile. So yeah, great. All right, we'll keep going.
Oh, sorry, there's one more question that just appeared here. So do all congregations have to get audited by an audit firm?
No, that was my comment. Small congregations are not required by CRA to get an audit, and certainly not by an auditing firm. It can simply be somebody within the congregation who can follow through the treasurer's handbook questions and points for doing an audit. If they have some financial background, certainly that helps, but they don't have to be a CPA. They simply can be someone who has some experience and can get the answers that are required in the handbook.
Okay, and someone's asking to define a small congregation. Is it based on income? There
is a number in that the CRA requires. Unfortunately, I don't know it. It's well above 95% of our congregations. So just because you have a $400,000 or $500,000 budget doesn't mean that you're required to get an audited statement.
I'll look and see if we can find that number and send it out when we send out the other information.
Okay, and there are a few more questions, Larry, if you are okay with that.
Sure.
Can a treasurer of one group be an auditor for the main books?
For one group? As in within that same congregation, if they are clearly independent of everything, there's still the conflict of they're auditing their own books. So that depends on the impact of what they are in charge of. So it doesn't sound like a good idea. One alternative is if you have a local congregation down the road, perhaps you can do each other's books. And someone within the presbytery that you know, you swap the audit obligations.
Okay, and for someone in the congregation who's doing the audit, is there a report template they can follow, or what does the report need to look like?
There isn't a particular template, simply answering those 28 odd questions that are in the handbook, which are just a guide, and they're checking all sorts of things, purely financial, and was the insurance paid, were the remits to PCC made, and that sort of a thing, not just sitting there and going line by line. A forensic audit is not required. So follow that appendix in the handbook, and the report can be as simple as I have reviewed the books and the processes and found things to be in a good order, or maybe as complex as having a number of recommendations to session. So there is no prescribed format.
Okay, and a couple more questions. Does it really make sense to get congregational approval on a budget 3 or 4 months into the year?
Good question. Debated this last night with one of my congregations. Really, if we're having to wait for investment review, then early March is likely the best, is the time in which you'll have that information and can get it into the AGM financial statements. But that's early March, as opposed to typically one has to wait till mid-February anyhow, just to get your normal reporting done. If you don't have investments, particularly stocks and bonds, where you're having to wait, then you can do the annual report earlier. You still have to give time for everybody to write the report and for the secretary or admin person to compile and get that printed.
I'm going to add this, actually. I think it was Bill, maybe you can comment on this. We said that some churches are moving to having a budget meeting in November the year before. So they're not presenting the budget at the annual general meeting. They're having a special meeting for just to look at the budget and get it approved before that next financial year. Do you want to comment on that?
It was actually I that had mentioned that, and some congregations do have budget meetings in November, December to set the budget, and that way, for example, stipends and salaries, they don't have to wait until February or March, pay out the staff at the previous year's rate, and then have to go back and make a correction or a catch up in March whenever they approve the budget. So you get the budget done ahead of time, and then effective January 1, you can start paying your stipends and salaries at the rate for the year.
The dilemma is always, do you have an accurate forecast of your revenue from your investment? So it is quite a dilemma.
You could do one in October, November that sort of passed it and then revised it when you looked at your March.
Absolutely, you can fine tune it then. There is also a question, does the auditor from the congregation have to be a member? Oh, no, they can be an adherent. They can be anyone who is appointed by the board or session.
Okay, and then just one comment, Oliver says that generally if the total revenue of a congregation is less than 250,000, then it can be considered a small congregation. And I think we're good with questions. Thanks, Larry.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that in the future.
Next slide, Jim. You're on.
All right. Well, we're going to be talking about narrative budget. And to start out talking about narrative budgeting, which is very different than the kind of budgeting we've been talking about, let's talk first about the top 3 reasons that people give. Now, a Barna Foundation survey shows the top 3 reasons people give as being: 1, that people want to be part of something that impacts others. They believe in the mission and vision of the nonprofit they're giving to. So for congregations, this means that they want to see how they are participating in God's mission, and that they're not just paying the bills to keep the building open. Second of all, people are looking for trust and authenticity in the places and people to which they give. They want to have confidence in church leadership. And number 3, people need to see evidence of responsible management, accountability with consistent, regular communication of results. They want transparency. They want to be assured you achieved what you communicate that you are doing. So let's keep this in mind as we look at the different budget options we're going to present. So the church's line item budget is an accounting and management tool. It's what is going to help answer questions, reasons 2 and 3 of why people give: confidence in leadership and accountability and transparency. A narrative budget, on the other hand, is an educational and visioning tool, which you can use to help capture people's hearts, speaking to the mission and vision of the congregation. And we can be intentional in how we use both these tools. So your line item budget keeps track of church income and expenses. It does not easily connect church spending with church vision. And it doesn't tell the story of how you are achieving that vision. And yet that's the main reason why people give. So for instance, people don't give to the Cancer Society so they can pay for the staff and the rent and the heating bills at the administrative office. They give because, first of all, it supports people with cancer, and secondly, it funds research towards the cure for cancer, and then finally, it supports caregivers. However, there won't be any supports or research without the infrastructure to support it. So by linking dollars to mission, a narrative budget inspires and informs donors about the importance and impact of their gifts. It allows you to share your budget in a way that gives a fresh perspective on the ministry your church is doing at home and in the world. So to create a narrative budget, you must start with good data. So you need a good fiscal line item budget, one that is sustainable and connected to that vision and is achievable for your church. And once you have that budget in place, you need to transform the data to tell your congregation's story. To do that, you're going to resort and summarize the church's line item budget into missional categories, and then add visuals, graphs, pictures, so that people can see what their gifts are accomplishing. So to make your narrative budget, you need to assign the different lines from your line ministry budget to key areas of ministry. So it's not an accounting exercise, and it's very subjective. But the idea is to build a reasonable snapshot of how resources, time, talent, and treasure are used in the church, while allocating figures to ministry areas. That can be challenging at first. With each subsequent year, the process does become easier. So let's look at how we can create and assign missional categories. Now, first of all, determining the mission categories and creating the percentages may not be the treasurer's job. It should be taken on by the session. The more help you have creating the narrative budget, the more ownership you'll have for the budget overall, and the more people will be willing to support it. So it's worth the time to build participation in your budget building. You can use the figures collected by the minister for tax purposes to help determine how to distribute the minister's time across the narrative budget categories. And frankly, it offers a good opportunity to discuss with the minister about how they're using their time. So talk to committee chairs who might consult with their committees and get input from other church staff, ministers, youth workers, administrators, etc., about how they use their time and how they support the different narrative categories themselves. So let's take a look at this. After we agree on our narrative budget categories, which you can see here highlighted in yellow, right here. We estimate the percentage of each budget summary category that should be applied to each narrative category. So you'll notice in column 1, we've listed summary lines that come from the line item budget. For instance, we add up the amount spent on facilities and grounds, and then we work out how much of that cost as a percentage applies to the mission-based categories of a narrative budget. So let's look at your congregation's facilities and grounds. The expenses in this category might be utilities, heat, hydro, water, landscapers, cleaners, minor repairs, renovations. In a line item budget, these would each get their own lines, but we know the grounds and facilities are used for a lot of different things. The sanctuary is used for worship and community concerts and youth movie nights. The Sunday school rooms are used for learning and to host Alcoholics Anonymous and the youth group and WMS groups and more. And sometimes they might be used to make an income. But this chart shows that this congregation has decided that facilities and grounds are used 35% of the time for worship. Let me just push that aside so I can show you. So facilities and grounds, what do we have? Oh, actually, in this case, it's 40% right here, 40% for worship. 25% to learning, is that right? That's what it says. Yes, 25% to learning here. And the balance to other categories, because the facilities and grounds are needed for most church activities. So you'll find that expenses will fit in a variety of narrative categories. The nice thing is it's not an accounting process. So it's just a communications tool. And the more involvement you have in helping create the categories, the less chance there will be a lot of debate about them at your AGM. Now we take the actual numbers from the line item budget and multiply them by the percentages we've determined, which distributes the budget summary subtotals across the narrative budget categories. For instance, we take human resources as a line item subtotal for this example, which is calculated to be $300,000. And using the percentages in the blue table above, we distribute that expense across the narrative budget categories here. So with the 35% indicated under worshiping in the blue table, here we are, multiplying out to $105,000 in the yellow table below. So we do this for all the percentages for each narrative budget category, and then add each narrative budget category up at the bottom down here. And those narrative budget totals are used to create a pie chart. Now, I used a fairly large congregation example here just to help you see the difference in the numbers. And this is the pie chart. And as you can see here how this congregation's expenses now tell the story of what we achieved together as a congregation. To some extent, how we spend our resources shares what's important to us as a congregation. And this helps us to see it clearly. In this sense, it can also be a planning tool, because we can see how our gifts are put to work and decide if we want to shift that for future years. Now, a lot of treasurers like pie charts, but that's because we're numbers people, but they might not mean a lot to others. Another way to say the exact same thing with these figures is to break down a gift of $100 into the categories you've chosen. For people who are concerned that their money may be getting burned up in administrivia, it's nice to see just how each dollar is spent. So we see 14% turns into $14, which supports evangelism and mission programs, and $18 supports education, etc. So I think that would create a lot of positive feeling in people. Now, here's another example of expenses categorized in a slightly different way. You'll notice that they assume more for administration, and they further separate mission from evangelism and youth from children, etc. So it's totally up to you how you want to break out your narrative categories. It should be tied into your annual reports. And here's the pie chart from that second example. And this pie chart came straight out of Microsoft Excel and went directly into PowerPoint, ready to present at your annual congregational meeting. Once you have your missional categories in a pie chart, you can decide how to present them to the congregation. This is an example of a narrative budget presented in a simple 4-page bulletin insert. And page 1 has the pie chart on it and a simple statement about the congregation's mission and vision. Page 2 says a bit more about the 6 missional categories. Each category has a deeper description, which was drawn from the story of the congregation, is simultaneously telling in the annual report. So budget amounts are categorized into 6 missional categories. In this case, the categories are based on the story the congregation is simultaneously telling. So our example keeps it simple, but there are other components you might consider incorporating into a longer document. There are statistics, case histories, stories you can tell, quotes, infographics, photos of your church in action. We made a very simple one, so it was easy to explain how they work, but you can make many pages and make a real booklet out of it if you want to. And as you can see here, a narrative approach to communicating your budget allows you to better communicate the vision of the church. So this sample, by the way, is available on the PCC website just by searching for narrative budgets. Now, this is the final page on that. And in this case, it shows how a person can give to support the mission they just read about. So this bulletin insert keeps everything simple, but you could also have a longer document, as I was saying. And as you can see here, a narrative budget allows you to share how gifts connect to the vision of the church. As I mentioned, this is available on the PCC website. Now, the narrative budget tells the story of undesignated gifts to your general fund. It helps people know what their offering envelopes and PAR achieve. But we also know people like to give designated gifts, and you can use a narrative budget to help you determine numbers like these, because you don't just use the actual cost, but can add a percentage for administration, because you know what the real administration percent is. Remember to include other statistics in your narrative budget to help show what the congregation is doing beyond gifts of money. Finally, remember that the narrative budget is a communication piece. Make your narrative budget attractive, inviting, and engaging. Think about the value of cartoons and drawings and charts and personalized invitations, questions and answers, FAQs, emotional honesty, high quality design and layout, drama. Include art from youth and children. Excuse me. Use surprising, delightful, or inviting words focused on impact, and feature testimonials or stories when you can. A creative volunteer might even make a simple video about the narrative budget. So if you need any help with setting up a narrative budget, please contact me in the Plan Giving and Stewardship Department for advice and assistance. And I guess we now can find out if there's any questions about this.
Hi, Jim. Yep, there are a couple questions. One, should committee chairs provide the narrative component of the AGM and the treasurer provide a means of quantifying the financial impact?
Oh, that would be a terrific way to do it. Every church is different, and that sounds, if those relationships can develop a set of narrative budget categories together, that's fantastic. That would be great. So yeah.
Okay, and what would be included in keeping things going?
Oh, in my case, when I built this, it was anything that was basically just self-evidently administrivia. Anything that where you just felt that you really had to put a portion of it aside for just the cost of administration. So we distributed, I mean, actually I can show you, it's actually here, but for the sake of time, you can take a look at the document that I made, because it does break it down. And this video does have the image of how I did it if we go back in time, but I don't want to go back that and spend time on that right now. But
I thought that's because you saw my face. I thought that was that, Jim.
Yeah, I was like, don't do that, Jim.
We're going to actually talk more about administration when it comes to filing your T3010. So this will get expanded a little bit more. And then at the end, we can talk about it more if we need to.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for questions, but there's one comment that is good to share. Given that COVID has reshaped all of these things, the percentages may not be a true representation, and instead an exception from ordinary times. So that's all the questions.
And I would agree with that. I think this is a narrative budget. It's what you think you're going to spend things on, but it'll also help you see if things shifted. You could actually do a similar narrative budget on what you actually did. So it could be a narrative annual report where you said, oh, this is actually what we ended up spending on worship. This year, we ended up spending a lot more on caring for people because of COVID.